In 2007, Andrew McAuley attempted something almost no one would dare, kayaking alone from Tasmania to New Zealand. No support crew, no rescue team waiting nearby, just him and the open ocean. For weeks, he pushed through freezing waves and violent storms. He filmed everything. He sounded steady, in control. Then, just hours from reaching land, he made one final radio call. This is the story of how close he came, and what happened in the last stretch of water between survival and tragedy. On February 9th, 2007, a garbled satellite phone call came through to a rescue coordination center in New Zealand. The voice on the other end was barely recognizable, broken up by static and howling wind. The caller was Andrew McAuley, a 39-year-old Australian kayaker, alone somewhere in the Tasman Sea, roughly 30 kilometers from the coast of New Zealand's South Island. He'd been paddling for almost 30 days across one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet. He was close, painfully close, and then the line went dead. Search aircraft scrambled. Helicopters swept the coastline in the open water. They found his kayak capsized and waterlogged, drifting near Milford Sound. His body was never recovered. The kayak's cockpit was empty. His video camera was still inside, sealed in a waterproof case. And what was on that camera would later reveal a journey so brutal, so relentlessly punishing, that it raised a question nobody could comfortably answer. Was Andrew McAuley a visionary explorer pushing human limits, or a man whose obsession with adventure crossed into something reckless, something that cost him everything? That question still doesn't have a clean answer, and honestly, trying to reduce his story to one or the other misses the point entirely. Andrew McAuley was born on September 23, 1967, in Melbourne, Australia. From an early age, he wasn't the kind of kid who sat still. He was drawn to the outdoors, to physical challenges, to anything that carried an element of risk. As he grew older, that pull didn't fade. It intensified. He became a deeply skilled adventurer, one of the most accomplished sea kayakers Australia had ever produced. He was also a qualified mountain climber, a scuba diver, and he held degrees in outdoor education and sports science. This wasn't some amateur thrill seeker with a death wish. McAuley understood risk at a technical level. He studied it. He taught it. He built his professional life around assessing and managing it. By the time he was in his mid-30s, his resume of expeditions was genuinely staggering. He'd kayaked solo around the southern tip of New Zealand. He'd paddled across Bass Strait, the notoriously rough waterway between mainland Australia and Tasmania. He'd climbed in the Himalayas. He'd completed solo kayaking trips in conditions that would make experienced sailors think twice. And he wasn't doing any of this with massive corporate sponsorship or support teams trailing behind him in motorboats. McAuley operated on tight budgets, often modifying his own equipment by hand, pushing the boundaries of what a single human being in a small boat could survive. But there was one challenge that consumed him more than any other: the Tasman Sea. The Tasman Sea sits between Australia and New Zealand, roughly 2,200 kilometers of open ocean. It is, by almost any measure, one of the harshest bodies of water on Earth. The Southern Ocean feeds into it, driving massive swells that can reach 10 to 15 meters during storms. Winds are unpredictable and violent. The water temperature hovers around 12 to 15 degrees Celsius for much of the year, cold enough to kill an unprotected person in hours. Currents are complex and powerful. There's no shipping lane to speak of in the middle section, meaning if something goes wrong, you are profoundly alone. Commercial sailors and racing yachts treat the Tasman with extreme caution. The idea of crossing it solo in a kayak was considered by most people in the adventure community to be somewhere between extremely ambitious and flatly insane. McAuley didn't see it that way. Or rather, he saw it exactly that way, and that's precisely why he wanted to do it. He'd studied the crossing for years. He analyzed weather patterns, current data, and the performance characteristics of different kayak designs. He consulted with meteorologists and oceanographers. He modified a standard sea kayak to include a small sleeping compartment, essentially a narrow covered section where he could lie down inside the kayak to rest while drifting. The modifications were clever but crude. He added outriggers for stability, sealed compartments for gear storage, a small sail he could deploy in favorable winds to conserve energy. The kayak was roughly 6 meters long. His entire world for the duration of the crossing would be this narrow fiberglass shell, floating on top of an ocean that could swallow container ships. He also rigged the kayak with a satellite phone, an EPIRB, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, a GPS unit, and a handheld video camera. The camera mattered to him. McAuley wanted to document the crossing partly because he hoped to produce a film or documentary that might help fund future expeditions, and partly because, honestly, he seemed to understand on some level that this trip might be the kind of thing people would want to see whether it succeeded or failed. His wife, Vicky McAuley, supported him, but support is a complicated word here. She understood who he was. She knew that asking him not to go would be like asking him not to breathe. They had a young son together, and she later said in interviews that she wrestled constantly with the tension between loving this man for who he was and being terrified of what that identity might cost their family. She didn't try to stop him, but she also wasn't naive about the risks. Nobody close to McAuley was naive about the risks. The adventure community in Australia had mixed reactions. Some admired his ambition and his meticulous preparation. Others were blunt. They thought the crossing was a suicide mission disguised as an expedition. The Tasman had never been crossed solo by kayak. There was a reason for that. The ocean didn't care about your preparation. The ocean didn't care about your skill level. In conditions that extreme, a single rogue wave, a single equipment failure, a single moment of exhaustion at the wrong time, and you were dead. No rescue team could reach you fast enough in the middle of that crossing. McAuley had actually attempted the crossing once before, in late 2006. He launched from the southern tip of Tasmania, heading east toward New Zealand. That attempt ended after just a few days when his kayak capsized in heavy seas and he activated his EPIRB. He was rescued, shaken but alive. A lot of people assumed that would be the end of it, that the near-death experience would knock some sense into him. It didn't. If anything, it sharpened his resolve. He studied what went wrong, made modifications to his kayak, adjusted his route planning, and started preparing for a second attempt almost immediately. The second attempt launched on January 11, 2007. McAuley departed from Fortrose, a small coastal settlement at the southern tip of New Zealand's South Island. Wait, that detail needs correcting. He actually launched from the coast of Tasmania, heading toward New Zealand's South Island. His planned route would take him roughly 1,600 kilometers across the Tasman, aiming to make landfall near Milford Sound on New Zealand's southwest coast. He estimated the crossing would take approximately 30 days, depending on weather conditions. From the moment he left shore, the Tasman did what the Tasman does. It tried to kill him. The footage recovered from his waterproof camera tells the story in fragments. You see McAuley paddling through enormous swells, waves towering above his tiny kayak. You see him bailing water from the cockpit, constantly, endlessly, because the waves kept breaking over him and flooding the boat. You hear him talking to the camera in moments of relative calm, sometimes reflective, sometimes exhausted beyond words, sometimes genuinely frightened. The camera caught him at his most vulnerable, recording entries that feel less like expedition logs and more like messages from a man who wasn't sure he'd make it home. The conditions during the crossing were savage. He encountered multiple storms. Winds exceeding 60 knots battered him. Swells reached 8 to 10 meters regularly, with some waves reportedly much larger. His kayak capsized multiple times. Each capsize meant plunging into frigid water, fighting to right the boat, hauling himself back inside, then spending precious energy bailing out the cockpit before the next wave hit. Sleep was almost impossible. When he did sleep, it was in the enclosed compartment of the kayak while it drifted, and even then he'd be woken constantly by waves slamming into the hull or the boat rolling violently. His food supplies were limited. He carried freeze-dried meals, energy bars, and water. Preparing hot food required a small camp stove that he could barely use inside the cramped kayak without risking a fire. Dehydration was a constant threat. Cold was a constant threat. Fatigue was a constant threat, and loneliness, being utterly, completely alone in the middle of an ocean for weeks on end, that was its own kind of threat, the psychological kind that doesn't show up on any equipment checklist. He made satellite phone calls during the crossing, checking in with his shore support team and with Vicky. These calls were often brief, limited by battery life and signal quality. In some calls, he sounded confident. In others, the strain was obvious. He reported hallucinations at various points during the trip, a common symptom of extreme sleep deprivation and isolation. He saw things that weren't there. He heard things that weren't there. His mind, starved of sleep and sensory input beyond the endless gray ocean, started manufacturing its own reality. Despite all of this, he kept going. Day after day, paddle stroke after paddle stroke, he dragged himself across the Tasman Sea. And the crazy thing is, he was making it. His GPS tracking showed steady progress eastward. He was covering the distance. He was surviving conditions that should have killed him several times over. By early February 2007, he was approaching the New Zealand coast. He was within 30 kilometers of Milford Sound. After nearly 30 days alone on the Tasman, the coastline was within reach, and then everything fell apart. The details of McAuley's final hours are pieced together from his last satellite phone calls and the footage on his recovered camera. On February 9th, conditions deteriorated rapidly. A storm system moved through, bringing large swells and high winds near the New Zealand coast. The approach to Milford Sound is treacherous even for large vessels. The coastline is rugged. The waters around it are shallow in places and subject to powerful tidal currents. And the weather in that part of New Zealand's fjordland can change with terrifying speed. McAuley, exhausted after a month at sea, physically depleted, sleep-deprived to the point of hallucination, was trying to navigate this final stretch in deteriorating conditions. His last confirmed communication came on the morning of February 9th. The call was broken, difficult to understand. He reported that conditions were rough. He gave a position that placed him close to shore, and then contact was lost. The New Zealand Rescue Coordination Center launched a search operation. Aircraft and helicopters were deployed to the area around Milford Sound. They found McAuley's kayak relatively quickly. It was floating upside down, partially submerged, roughly 30 kilometers from the coast. The cockpit hatch was open. His equipment was still inside, including the waterproof camera. There was no sign of McAuley himself. Divers examined the kayak and the surrounding area. An extensive sea and air search continued for days. His body was never found. The official conclusion was that McAuley had capsized in the rough conditions near the coast and, unable to re-enter the kayak or hold on in the cold water, had drowned. Whether he was incapacitated by exhaustion, hypothermia, injury from the capsize, or some combination, nobody knows for certain. The Tasman Sea kept that answer for itself. The recovered camera footage was later used in a documentary film called Solo, directed by David Michôd and released in 2008. The film is difficult to watch. It shows McAuley's deterioration over the course of the crossing in unflinching detail. You watch a strong, capable man slowly being ground down by the ocean. You see the fear in his eyes during the worst moments. You hear him talking about his wife and his son, and you can hear the conflict, the pull between the man who needs to complete this crossing and the father who wants to come home. The documentary doesn't try to make McAuley a hero or a fool. It presents what happened and lets the audience sit with it, and sitting with it is deeply uncomfortable. The aftermath of McAuley's disappearance hit the Australian adventure community hard. There was grief, obviously, for a man who was widely respected and genuinely liked, but there was also an uncomfortable reckoning. People who had quietly warned the Tasman crossing was too dangerous felt vindicated, but that vindication tasted bitter. People who had admired his courage questioned whether courage without sufficient regard for the consequences was really courage at all. Vicky McAuley handled the aftermath with remarkable composure. She participated in the documentary. She spoke publicly about her husband's life and legacy. She didn't try to sanitize what happened or pretend the risks hadn't been real. She also didn't announce his decision to go. In interviews, she described the painful clarity of loving someone whose identity was built around pushing into dangerous places. She raised their son knowing that his father had died doing something he believed in, and she left it to the boy to decide, when he was old enough, what to make of that. The coroner's inquest into McAuley's death was held in New Zealand. The findings were straightforward. He died by drowning after his kayak capsized in rough seas near Milford Sound. The coroner noted McAuley's extensive experience and preparation, but also observed that the Tasman crossing represented a level of risk that, regardless of preparation, carried a high probability of a fatal outcome. The coroner stopped short of calling the expedition reckless, but the implication hovered in the air. There's been a lot of debate since McAuley's death about where the line falls between acceptable risk and unacceptable risk in adventure sports. The debate doesn't have a resolution, and it probably never will, because the line is different for every person. McAuley's supporters argue that human progress and exploration in understanding what the human body and mind can endure requires people willing to push past the boundaries of what's considered safe. Every major expedition in history from polar exploration to high-altitude mountaineering to space travel, involved someone accepting a level of risk that most people would consider unreasonable. McAuley was operating in that tradition. He knew what he was doing. He accepted the consequences, and he came agonizingly close to succeeding. His critics argue that the calculation changes when you have a family, that a young child and a wife who depend on you alter the moral math of risk-taking, that there's a difference between accepting personal risk and imposing the consequences of that risk on people who didn't choose it. McAuley's son didn't choose to grow up without a father. Vicky didn't choose to become a widow. Those outcomes were products of McAuley's decision, and no amount of posthumous admiration for his courage changes that reality. Both arguments have weight. Neither fully captures the situation. What's undeniable is that McAuley's attempt was, from a purely physical standpoint, extraordinary. He spent roughly 30 days alone on one of the world's most hostile oceans, in a vessel barely larger than a bathtub. He survived storms, capsizes, equipment failures, hallucinations, and exhaustion that would have broken most human beings within the first week. He paddled approximately 1,500 kilometers across open ocean under his own power, and he made it to within sight of land. The Tasman crossing has since been completed by other kayakers. James Castrician and Justin Jones crossed the Tasman in a specially designed double kayak in 2008, roughly a year after McAuley's death, making the first successful kayak crossing of the Tasman Sea. Their expedition used a larger, more stable vessel with better safety systems, and they traveled as a pair, which makes an enormous difference in terms of managing fatigue, capsizes, and emergencies. They acknowledged McAuley's attempt as a major inspiration and spoke about him with visible respect. McAuley's story also forced a broader conversation in Australia about how society treats its adventurers. There's an odd cultural tension around people like McAuley. When they succeed, they're celebrated as national heroes, put on magazine covers, invited to give corporate keynote speeches. When they die, the narrative shifts almost immediately. Suddenly they're reckless, selfish, irresponsible. The same traits that made them inspirational in success, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept limits, the willingness to risk everything, become character flaws in failure. McAuley experienced both sides of this without even changing. He was the same person before and after February 9, 2007. Only the outcome changed. The footage from his camera, the parts that were shown in the solo documentary, includes a moment near the end that stays with people. McAuley, visibly gaunt, his face weathered and his eyes hollowed from weeks of deprivation, looks into the camera and talks about what this crossing means to him. He doesn't sound like a man on a suicide mission. He doesn't sound like a man who's given up on coming home. He sounds like a man who is fully aware that he might die, has made peace with that possibility, but still believes, genuinely, completely believes that he can make it. That tension between lucid self-awareness and what some might call irrational commitment is what makes his story so hard to categorize and so impossible to forget. His body was never recovered from the Tasman Sea. He is presumed drowned, has remained somewhere in the deep waters off New Zealand's Fiordland coast. He was 39 years old. His son was a toddler. His wife was 37. The Tasman Sea crossing, the thing that killed Andrew McAuley, measured roughly 1,600 kilometers. He completed all but the last 30 kilometers. In a car, that's a 20-minute drive. On foot, it's a day's walk. In a kayak, on calm water, it's a few hours of paddling. But in the Tasman, in a storm, for a man who'd been alone on the ocean for a month, those 30 kilometers were an uncrossable distance. The ocean gave him almost everything he asked for, let him survive things that should have killed him a dozen times over, and then, right at the end, right when he could almost see the shore, it took him. There's no neat lesson in that, no clean moral, just a man, an ocean, and 30 kilometers of water that might as well have been the distance to the moon. And here we've reached the end of our story. That's all for this one. If you value deep, honest storytelling, leave a like and let me know your thoughts below. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, goodbye and good night.